Okay, here we are. We're here for another Asking for a Friend session. My name's Andy Wright, and Asking for a Friend is an initiative by Never Not Creative, Young Bloods and Mentally Healthy. We've got a couple of great guests today, Laura and Michael. Hello, guys. How are you?
Hello. Good, thank you.
So we'll do some intros into you shortly. But a little bit more about Asking for a Friend as we get going. So Asking for a Friend exists because we wanted to create a safe place for where you can ask the unaskable, the type of questions that you're worried may change the way people treat you at work or affect the opportunities that you might get. So we're bringing together industry leaders and mental health professionals to give non-judgmental responses in a safe, anonymous environment. So before I get into a few more introductions, just a little bit of housekeeping. So the way that this platform works is that you'll see on the right-hand side of your screen, there is a chat panel. So we've just had a hello and afternoon already in there. Feel free to say hello. Also, you can use this for just, if you want to agree with things or you want clarification around something, just drop a message into the chat and that will help us sort of guide the discussion a little bit. If you've got links to things that you think might be useful for other people, feel free to drop those in as well. And then we have the more kind of official, the questions panel. So that's next to the chat tab. And that's where we'll get into live questions from the audience about halfway through this. So we've had a really healthy amount of questions that have been sent in beforehand through the site. But please add your questions into the questions tab as we'll start to get through to those as we get over sort of the halfway mark. If you need more immediate help, and you might be struggling with anything right now, you can also find lots of great resources, lines to call, all that kind of stuff, free support. I've just put the link into the chat now, and that's on our Mentally Healthy website. Caveat: everything that we do with Never Not Creative and Mentally Healthy is volunteer run. So essentially this is, it's unofficial. We're a bunch of people using community to come together and tackle the challenges that people might be facing in our industry. So with that in mind, just remember that this is anonymous. And so we don't have the context for your questions, but we're going to do everything we can to kind of give you some good advice, which is a good first step perhaps to be able to go and get some more help from other people where you are able to provide a little bit more context. So if things are getting serious for you, you should absolutely seek professional help, whether that's financial, legal, or mental health related as well. So with the housekeeping out of the way, I'm delighted to welcome Laura Aldington. Laura's worked in the UK, America, Australia over a 20-year career. She originally joined Host in 2006 as the head of account management after roles in Australia and UK. And between 2010 and 2013, relocated to New York as a board member at Anomaly in New York. Returning to Host as managing director, she became the agency's CEO before taking the helm of a new venture that brought together Host with Havas Sydney to create one of Australia's most progressive new agencies. And Laura's also a board member of the Communications Council, which of course is now the Advertising Council of Australia. Welcome, Laura.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for taking the time out to come into this session. And we also have Michael. So Michael Hines is a registered psychologist specializing in mindfulness, resilience, and well-being, which is perfect because we actually have a few questions around mindfulness and resilience in this session. His expertise and passion for mindfulness is underpinned by personal meditation practice and professional development spanning 20 years. He's taught mindfulness at Monash University, University of New South Wales, and in organisations and schools across Australia. Michael currently works at Smiling Mind as the head of content development and lead facilitator. He's responsible for the design and delivery of mindfulness programs and workshops in schools, workplaces, and communities across Australia. He's also at home with a dog and a small child. So being in lockdown in Melbourne, but we really appreciate you being able to take the time to join us today. So thanks, Michael.
No worries, pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Cool. Okay, so we're going to get into the questions. We've had quite a few questions come in through the site, which has been really good. And there's definitely a few tough questions, which is, of course, what we ask for and what we expect. So we'll start with you, Michael, with this question. How can I give more support to my partner at home? We're both working from home at the moment, but I feel like she's struggling with focus and motivation and is starting to worry about if she might lose her job.
Yeah. So I'm sure, whoever sent this question in isn't alone. I'm sure it's a really common scenario at the moment that we've got people in some ways stuck at home with their significant others trying to navigate work and life and all the rest of it. Dogs and children, in my case. I think...
On cue. That was amazing.
Right on cue. Actually, you're going to have to give me 1 second, literally give me 10 seconds or this will just continue.
Was that might have been a cry for help so that things didn't get messy, I guess.
Sorry about that. That would have just gone on. Yes, it's a really tricky scenario. There's no simple answers to this. I think, obviously with the partner, really normalising what they're going through is probably the first step. Really trying to be present with them and listen, as opposed to, that tendency that we all often have, which is to go to solution mode and look to solve the problem. Often people just want to be heard and get a sense that they're understood, as opposed to trying to solve it. When it comes to motivation, it's important to keep in mind that motivation often comes second. If we only ever did something when we felt like doing it, there's probably a whole lot of stuff we'd never do. So sometimes we can't wait for the motivation to be there to do things. So often just getting started on something, the motivation will then kick in. So it's really important not to wait, for the motivation to sort of show up. You could be waiting a while. I think on the topic of worry, again, really normal, especially at the moment with everything that's going on. We all, our brains have a sort of hardwired negativity bias. We're more likely to look for problems, threats and danger. It's sort of an evolutionary adaptive sort of function of the brain. So we are going to worry. But it's worth remembering that just because we think something, it doesn't actually make it a fact. So it's important to sort of really just try and notice some of that thinking and that worry. Expect it to show up. It's really normal. But when it shows up, see if we can just notice it and be curious about it, as opposed to assuming it's going to happen. Yeah,
definitely. Louise, anything? Laura, sorry, anything you want to add to that?
No, that's a great answer. I think, from my perspective, even the fact that you're asking the question on behalf of your partner and trying to help them is an awesome commendation to you. So
that's really good.
Okay,
so we're going to move on. We're all on video right now, and the next question is a kind of video etiquette, and Zoom etiquette in particular. So how do you respond when you're asked to participate in a camera on Zoom meeting when you feel compromised having your life, house, children, bedroom, undies on show? There's a lot of Zoom camera shaming at the moment for people that keep their cameras off, but might have a valid reason. How do we tackle this one?
Yeah, the old Zoom etiquette question. Who knew we'd spend so much time this year debating that? I think I can probably try and first of all give you a bit of perspective about why someone might be asking you to switch your camera on, because I don't know that that's always well communicated. But it's interesting because I had this very conversation with my agency just a couple of days ago. So I run an all agency meeting every other morning, and during the height of the pandemic, I was running one every day. And that sort of required me to show up every day, whether I was camera ready or more often than not, I had my hair in a towel and the cat on my keyboard and a child in the background and all of, it could be complete chaos, but I showed up. And when I look out and I see a sea of black screens, I know that it's nobody's intent at all, but it is really hard to talk to black screens. And it can feel, and I know this isn't usually the intent by any stretch of the imagination, it can feel like people aren't listening or that they're not participating actively in the meeting. And that can end up reading to the person who's hosting the meeting as a sign of disrespect. And it's sort of like if you were in a meeting with someone in the real world and they sat with their back to you, kind of how that might make you feel. And I think if you expect to see that person, then it's reasonable for them to want to see you back. That said, I know how hard it can be sometimes. And, I think it depends what your valid reason is. I'd sort of say if it's your undies, just move them out of the way. But if you are really feeling like having your camera on is going to inhibit your participation in the conversation or add to your anxiety, then I'd just say it's a question of etiquette and good manners to let the host know that you don't want to put your camera on. And so if someone said to me, I'd have no problem if someone said, "Hey, Laura, thanks for showing up today. If it's okay with you, I'd prefer to keep my camera off, but rest assured I'm listening to everything that we're discussing." because actually what they're fearing when they're looking at that sea of blank screens is that people aren't engaged, and that might not be the case at all. But if you let them know that you are engaged and listening, then that kind of usually negates the need to put it on. And if you feel comfortable, and there's no obligation to, if you feel comfortable explaining why, then, you know, that can also help. You know, you might go, look, I think my backdrop's going to be a bit distracting, or just not feeling like I'm going to be able to participate fully if I've got my camera on. That's fine. And then I think if it's a smaller group, just saying, hey, does anyone object to me switching my camera off for this call? I've been on Zoom all day, and I think you'll get more out of me if I can just switch it off. But you know, I am participating, I am here, I am present, I am listening. Are all the things that I think people are looking for when they're asking you to turn your camera on. What they're really asking you to do is reassure them that you're engaged in the conversation. So it's not just, it's just about having some empathy for the person on the call that you're talking to and how they might be feeling, and kind of reassuring them that you're there.
I have I switched a few of my meetings in the last few days to just a phone call, and it was refreshing as well to just be able to get away and stand up and walk around and have a chat. Michael, you're I think when we talked about this before, your business took actually a different approach, right? When it was how they were talking about Zoom etiquette.
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, I think they would have, the leadership, we had a chat about this at Smiling Mind, and I think everything you said, Laura, they would 100% agree with. But what they did do, I guess, further to that was really put out a directive for staff that it's okay, you know, if you feel the need to have your camera off for whatever reason it is. But I think that doesn't negate all the etiquette stuff that Laura just outlined. I think it's really important that goes with it. But as you say, in those smaller meetings, Laura, you know, if you say, look, you know, let's say it's 3 or 4 of you, I often find that if you suggest you're going to turn your camera off, everyone sort of welcomes that and jumps at the opportunity to turn theirs off as well. Or, and as you say, if it's a one-on-one, most people I'm finding are more than probably preferring just to jump on a phone call. But as you say, you can walk around. I think it just feels a little bit more natural than, you know, this sat looking at one another on a screen all day.
Yeah. And the other difference as well is that, you know, in that, you know, like you gave that example of it's like having your back turned to someone. There's also just the constant of having to look at your own face as well, right? Like that can get a little bit much.
When we had this chat at Smiling Mind, a lot of people, I wasn't aware that you could hide your self view on Zoom. So a lot of people chimed in and said once they discovered that and started hiding the self view, they found it so much less
you're less conscious of
anxiety provoking. They got less self-conscious. So that's another little trick.
Next question is related to, we just recently released the mentally healthy research, and one of the things that we found out that people are looking for better mental well-being in their workplace is that they would like to see more empathetic and educated leaders when it comes to mental health. And I think as a result, this next question is has perhaps someone concerned about how to get that right. And so this question, we'll go to you first, Michael, but how do I make sure that being empathetic does not come across as flirting in the workplace? Yeah,
it's an interesting one. When I heard that question, the first thing I thought is it's potentially an occupational hazard of being really present with someone. So, you know, it's quite rare these days, you know, that we give someone our full attention. And I think when we do, because it's becoming a rarer commodity, I think, you know, that full attention that someone might shower us with, because we're not getting it all the time, it can potentially be misread as interest. But I mean, I think that would be a shame if it was misread in that way, because I think it's really lovely that someone's, you know, willing to connect on that authentic, genuine way. Hopefully we can just do it in a way that the person on the receiving end doesn't misinterpret that.
I mean, I think that it is it's something that people are navigating, as you said, Michael. I mean, I think they are quite different. I mean, I think flirting is behaving as if you are sexually attracted to someone, and empathy is trying to understand and share their feelings. And I think that only you know which one you are doing, and you are responsible for what you put out in the world, but you can't necessarily control how people receive that. So as long as you're in good faith, believe that your behavior is absolutely not flirtatious in any way, and someone is like, hey, how you feeling as a glance, then that's kind of something that they probably need to deal with rather than something that you need to worry about. If you think there's any chance that you are possibly flirting, then that's another thing altogether. And if that's unwelcome, then that, then that person would be entitled to perceive that as such. But I think you have to think about your motive and your intent. And if you feel in good faith that you are practicing empathy rather than flirtation, then that's what you're responsible for. And they are responsible for how they receive that.
Yeah. And I think also, there's so many different elements to empathy. Like, it doesn't have to be this proactive kind of like constantly, and it's also, it's not necessarily physical either, but a lot of empathy is just listening and understanding and then changing your actions as a result of that. So it's good to think about like the full gamut of what empathy means. And so it's definitely something that we're looking at the moment in the mentally healthy change group, because of just how overwhelming that response was by everyone was saying we want more empathetic leadership.
Yeah.
Laura, over to you. This is very much I guess an employee-employer question. Would it be inappropriate at the moment to ask my director what he or she is planning to do once JobKeeper ends? Should I begin to plan for the worst case scenario being once JobKeeper ends, I'm out of a job?
Yes, it's a great question. The short answer is no, I don't think it's inappropriate at all. I think that the trick will be in how you ask that question. And again, it's about having some empathy for the person that you're talking to in that conversation. That's probably going to yield you the best results. So if I think about how I would like to be asked that question, and I think it's a perfectly legitimate one, I think I'd want someone to acknowledge, thank you for the efforts that you're making to keep everybody employed. I can imagine that must be quite stressful. Please let me know if there's anything I could be doing to support you more. In the meantime, I'm aware that JobKeeper is coming to an end. I just wanted to check in and find out if you had any thoughts about what might happen at that point, and leave that open for them to answer that question. And I think that, good leaders will probably want to have a degree of transparency around that. And I think if you set the conversation up in a way that doesn't feel like you're going, what's the answer? I need an answer immediately and a plan, because they might not have one. That's the reality of this. No one really knows. Nobody really knows what's around the corner. If we've learned one thing, it's probably that.
Yeah.
I think the other part of your question, should you have a plan? I think a plan is always good. Although, as Mike Tyson famously said, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. But look, I think what that plan looks like depends a bit on how you feel about the job that you're in, and the business and the future that you see for yourself there. I think there's absolutely no reason why you shouldn't be thinking about maybe putting your CV together, updating your book if that's appropriate, maybe making some contact with some recruiters, just because I think sometimes that stuff can be easier to do when you're not reeling from everything that comes with a job loss and this sort of shock and everything that comes with that. You can do it in your own time and on your own agenda a little bit. And the other thing I think is worth thinking about is there's other ways to plan other than just thinking about another job. It might be like, how do you think about your finances and some things that you might be able to do to cushion the blow if you find yourself, without work. And those things can just give you some confidence if you know that you've laid some foundations and you've done some things proactively that will make that moment easier to cope with. The only thing I'd say is if you love the company and you love the role that you're in and you have faith in it, I wouldn't necessarily recommend jumping ship before you understand the full context, because those jobs aren't always easy to find. And if you're in a good one, you definitely want to, try and ride it out if they're committed to keeping you on board. So I think hopefully a transparent conversation would give you better context about how to make an informed decision about what the right thing for you to do is. But there's nothing to stop you maybe having some foundations or some things that are just giving you a bit of peace of mind that if that happens, you're more prepared than not.
Yeah. Michael, anything you want to add?
The only thing I would add is I think to Laura's point, I think that idea of planning can be really helpful, but I think we also need to just moderate how much of that we do and really try and sort of time block that in some ways. So, the mind will naturally wander into the future or back into the past, but at the moment our minds are probably spending a lot of time wandering into the future. Human beings, we really hate uncertainty. It's a really uncomfortable emotion, and humans, we dislike any discomfort, be it physical or emotional discomfort. So it's a really difficult feeling to sit with. So the mind, goes into problem solving mode, and it'll want to spend a lot of time running into the future, thinking about possible scenarios. And as we know, we don't know exactly how things are going to play out. So I think whilst it's good to plan, I think it's also good to try and sort of contain that to sort of specific times where you might sit down and go, right, I'm going to give 2 hours to some planning for the future, or do a CV or whatever it might be. But then once I've done that, how do I notice when my mind is just constantly wanting to ruminate and get hooked by some of that thinking around that uncertainty or that unknown future? And then just as much as possible, just gently bringing ourselves back to where we are right now and what's happening right now. But just trying to notice that mind's tendency to almost want to ruminate over that plan all day.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, great point.
Laura, back into employer and specifically our kind of advertising agency mode. This next question says, I'm currently working in an advertising agency abroad. The nature of the advertising world here is that it's normal for people to work overtime, so no one ever complains. Now, before COVID-19 happened, we would have overtime once in a while and no weekend work, so not a biggie. But now that it has happened, we all work from home, and this has created a major problem where we're constantly working at random times, bulldozing through weekends and holidays. This has made me feel super unappreciated by the company and has resulted in me feeling lazy and not wanting to give 100% to my work anymore. What can I do to overcome this feeling?
Yeah, wow, that's a great question. There's so much in that question. There's one where I'd love to ask you a million questions back to give you a really good answer on it, because there's so much to think about. I think I'll do my best with what you've said. I think there's quite a few things to unpack in that, because I think, first of all, it sounds like your agency didn't burden you too much pre-COVID. You kind of said like it was manageable, the amount of work that we did. And so it might be worth thinking about what's changed. And because it doesn't sound like it's something that's deeply embedded in the culture of the business, it sounds like it's a reaction to the sort of circumstances that we're in at the moment, in which case that's a good thing, because that's easier to change than when something's endemic to a company's kind of culture. So, you know, it could be that maybe the processes have got a bit sloppy, or maybe everyone's having to work harder for whatever reason. And it might be something that you can proactively suggest some constructive ways to solve. And that might help give you a feeling of control as well. It might just be that people are falling into bad habits, and rather than that they are deliberately or willfully sort of disrespecting your boundaries. So there might be ways that you can think of that would help get workloads more contained into working hours, because I'm sure everybody would appreciate that. And I mean, nobody really wants to, you use the word bulldoze, which is quite a strong piece of language, that it feels like it's just done without any sort of consultation. And so trying to introduce some of that into the conversation would be good. And then the second thing you said was, I think that it made you feel unappreciated. And that's kind of interesting as well, because I think that's a slightly different issue. Like, it's possible that you might be working hard but feel really valued in that context, and it doesn't sound like you feel like that's being valued or appreciated. So again, it might be worth having a think about what would make you feel appreciated. Is it that they're being rude? Is it that people aren't saying thank you? Is it that you've, and just trying to understand like what it is that will create a sense of greater value whilst concurrently trying to solve the overall problem. And then the third thing you said was it results in you feeling lazy. And I think when people say lazy, they often don't mean lazy. They often mean like, I just don't feel motivated. I don't feel as motivated, and I think that ends up, you can often end up in a bit of a vicious cycle where you don't feel motivated, therefore it kind of can take you longer to get things done. Therefore it feels like it bleeds into your free time more. Therefore you still, and I think trying to work out how you break that cycle is just about making sure that you're taking care of yourself and understanding your boundaries and how you want to set them and how you want to manage and communicate them with the people around you. So I think a lot of us, myself included, went from thinking I was working at home to feeling like I was just living at work. Yeah. Because it's so much harder to go, the reason it bulldozes into your weekends is because you're not leaving the office. There's no physical sign that you have stopped working. And I think there's just been a huge blurring of lines for everybody. And so understanding how to kind of reintroduce some of those boundaries, even if they're only in your mind and in your world. So taking a walk at the end of the day to demarcate like the official end of your working day and the start of your evening. When you don't have a commute to do that for you, you have to find ways to introduce those things more proactively, I think.
Yeah, great. Michael, anything you want to...
That was a great answer. I don't know if I can add too much to that. I think, that lack of structure, structure is, I guess, one of the big casualties, I think, of COVID and this working from home lifestyle. We've lost, we had natural structure, as you say, Laura, built into things like the daily commute and lunch breaks with colleagues or coffee catch-ups, whatever it is, whereas now we could just work straight through. So, yeah, just having a bit of self-discipline and a little bit of self-care as a priority around those boundaries and really trying to build that structure for ourselves, whatever works for you.
Yeah. I think the other thing, I always try and like to try and finish on a high. Sometimes you're working on something and you just go, oh, just get this finished, and then it's at least it's out of the way and done it. But you actually, when you've done that, it's more a sense of, oh, that's out the way, rather than actually coming back to it when you're still enjoying it. And still, obviously if there's a deadline for something, then you have to get it across the line. But I think sometimes it's good to sort of take that break when it comes that you're still enjoying doing that task.
I think the only other thing I was thinking, Laura, when you were chatting with motivation, which I know has come up a couple of times, we tend to be motivated by either external sort of factors. So we call that extrinsic motivation. So I guess reward and recognition and that sort of praise that we might get. I think it's really valuable, and we all want to feel valued at work. But we also need to be careful that our motivation isn't driven too much just by those external factors. We need to look for more what's called intrinsic motivation, which is where we're motivated by our own internal sort of values and reasons. So really looking at a role, for example, going, okay, what are my internal motivations for this, aside from whether anyone else in the business is patting me on the back or telling me I'm doing a good job? How do I try and tap into my own intrinsic motivation can be worthwhile as well.
Yeah, great. The next question, obviously, is a really great question and a brave one to ask. So every time my manager gives me feedback, it's all negative and aggressive. I can't help but cry. How can I stop crying? Yeah.
It's a really tough one, and my heart goes out to whoever asked the question. Most of us are pretty uncomfortable with crying at the best of times, but it's certainly something no one wants to do in the workplace, especially in front of a manager. I think, just to speak of the manager for a moment, I think, as I mentioned earlier, we all do have a hardwired negativity bias in the brain. So it's not unusual to notice people, be it professionally or personally, that are very, a lot of what they seem to say seems to be coming from that place. So, the way I heard this explained was the brain is like Velcro for negative experiences or threats and danger. It really sticks, and the brain's like Teflon for the good stuff. So when good things happen, it tends to just slide off. So that applies for all of us. But in this scenario, a manager, given that negativity bias, is probably going to be far more attuned to what this person's not doing well, as opposed to being able to take in and appreciate the good that no doubt this person's offering as well. But also in ourselves, when we get feedback from people, our brain is going to get very tuned into the critique. And I know this situation well enough to know whether there's any sort of positive feedback mixed in there as well. But often, someone could give us 3 or 4 things that we're doing well, but if they include one thing that we're not doing well, we'll go away from that and we'll lie awake at night ruminating about that one thing. The brain will almost ignore that the other stuff was said. So again, I don't know this scenario well enough to know this could be an example where it's just all negative, and obviously that's pretty unreasonable. In terms of the aggression, again, I don't think there's anything that really excuses that. I don't think there's a place for that in the workplace. But again, as we've sort of hinted at in some of these answers, we're all, including this manager, navigating a really difficult time, and our own internal emotional landscape we can often be quite pushed around by that. So often people are behaving in this way. It's an outward expression of the fact that there's some really difficult, complicated stuff happening for them. I don't think it comes from a place of malice, very rarely anyway. So again, it's hard to in this scenario, but trying to cultivate that two-way empathy that, okay, my manager could be really struggling at the moment. Again, it's not a get out of jail free card, but I think it's definitely a factor. In terms of the crying and, how do I stop it? I don't know if I like the answer to this one, because from my perspective, there's no real way to turn off an emotion. If we think of any emotion, if you just pause and think for a moment of someone you really love and care about, if I said to you, right, for the next minute, I just want you to turn off that emotion. I just want you not to feel any love for that person. We can't do it. Like, there's no on and off switch for emotion. So if we're feeling sadness, for example, there's no simple way just to switch that off. So often we wrestle with it, though, as if we can switch it off. And the brutal irony of that is the more we wrestle with it, often the bigger it gets. It tends to amplify the emotion. So I would be encouraging more just to tune in to the emotion, try and make room for it as best you can, even though it's a bit uncomfortable. I think that's probably that's probably the best I can offer on that one. It's really tricky though.
So Laura, I think you can share some experience with.
Yeah, I mean, like Michael, my sort of heart goes out to you as well. And if it helps you at all, I used to have exactly the same challenge. I used to really struggle in feedback meetings, and I would cry. And just wanted to let you know that, because I ended up being a CEO and no one gets to make me cry anymore. But it does change. I think what really helped me, I think we, like Michael said, we sort of attach shame to crying. And it's a weird human condition that we do that, because actually it's just a response to processing emotion, and you happen to process that through tears, and other people process it in different ways that are no better or worse than the way that you're processing it. And I often cry when I'm frustrated or I'm really angry, and it's not a sign of weakness. Like, sometimes I think if I wasn't crying, I'd be punching you in the face. Actually, you are welcome. I'm having this response in the meeting. So I think that, if they're being negative and aggressive, that is a bigger reflection on them than it is on you. And if I'm, one of the things that's helped me be is better at giving feedback, because I understand what it can be like to be on the receiving end of that and to struggle to process it a little bit. And I think that it shows me that you care and that you're really engaged in the conversation. And I think that you should feel, that's commendable. So, I think some of it's just, as Michael said, it's about finding some ease in the fact that you're crying, and just be like, that's just how I'm choosing. That's just how I'm processing this emotion in this moment. And that's okay. And I think once you kind of take its power away a little bit, it happens a lot less. And you're just processing an emotion, and that could equally be relief or happiness. Like, some people cry because they're overjoyed, and I think it's just a human instinct. And you might over time find other ways to learn other ways to process those emotions that you're more comfortable with. But otherwise, just have a bloody cry. It's fine. And I think that, like, I've cried in front of the entire agency, and I'm the CEO. So, don't attach too much to it. It would be my advice. And then I also think, in terms of the manager conversation, there might be a good discussion that you could have with them. I mean, it sounds like negative and aggressive doesn't sound like an ideal start point, but I think if you find a moment where you're not in that moment, to say, you'll notice that I sometimes cry when you give me feedback. It's not that I don't value and appreciate your feedback, because I do, and I really want you to keep giving me the feedback. It would really help me if you maybe gave it to me in this way, or you understood that I'm actually not upset, I'm just processing it, and that's just the way that I process it. And almost by naming it, it takes it again, it just sort of lessens the power of it. And I think if they're a good manager, they might find other ways to deliver that feedback with more empathy, or at least you might go, I'm in control of this. Because I think sometimes crying for us, because as Michael said, it's something visible that you can't control. It's, if you can try and get a little bit of a handle on you're owning that emotion and you're fine with it and you're comfortable with it, then it's often easier not to.
Yeah.
Laura, I think that point of trying to broach an open conversation about it at the right time, I think, is really valuable, because often, well, a lot of us walk around so caught up in our own self and our own emotions and our own problems, and this manager mightn't have that much awareness around how this behaviour is being sort of received. So sometimes by having that conversation, it creates greater awareness in the manager in this scenario, who might go, oh, okay, gee, I didn't realise I was being that negative. I didn't mean to be. The manager might be horrified to know that this is how it's being received, and often just creating that awareness around it can be really valuable for both.
Yeah, great. So we're about halfway through, and I'm going to do one or two more from the ones that came in, but I'm also going to start to move on to the live questions. So if anyone watching has a specific question they want to ask, don't forget you can put that into the questions tab. We've got a couple in already. You can also upvote questions as well. So if someone's already asked the question that you want to ask, you can upvote them, and we'll get to the more popular ones first. So Laura, another one around everything that's happening at the moment as an employee and an employer. So during COVID, the company I worked for up until recently forced all staff to take 1 day off a week to run down their annual leave. However, many, if not all, team members ended up taking the leave and having to work through their annual leave days due to workload. What's your response to a company that implements this type of money-saving technique at the expense of their staff's mental health and well-being, and how would you recommend staff deal with this situation?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to try and give you a commercial perspective on that, first of all, because I think that it sounds obvious, but sometimes being reminded about why your company might be making that decision and what they're trying to achieve with it might be quite helpful. And I know this sort of sounds obvious, but agencies are quite simple. They're hard, but they're not very complicated, in the sense that money comes in and money goes out. And the money comes in is the revenue that clients are paying you. And a big chunk of the money that goes out is staff costs. So in most agencies, it's at least 50%, and it can be as high as 70% of the money that comes in has to go straight out on paying for the team that you've got. And so when revenue goes down, and it has for many agencies, and often that is just the luck of what categories you have clients in and how they're faring and exactly what the nature of your agency business is. A lot of agencies have lost revenue, and therefore they have to look at where they can cut costs from a staff perspective. And the reason annual leave gets used is because it's a hard cost to agencies. If you leave and you have a month of leave accrued, they have to pay you that, so they have to have that in their budget. So running down the annual leave just reduces the amount of money they have to accrue, and it means they can spend it on other things. And so really, if they're asking you to take leave, they're trying to avoid making staff cuts in other ways, and that is job losses, pay cuts, or reductions in hours. So it's a way of keeping your staff paid at their full salary, but asking them to run their leave down alleviates some pressure on your staff costs. So I think the thing that I would say is this pandemic is just not ideal. It's a bit of an understatement, but I think agencies are having to just make choices all the time, and they're choosing between a bunch of not particularly ideal options. Like, I don't think there's a silver bullet here that they're not doing sort of willfully. I think that they've likely made the call that asking everyone to take holiday, and I'm not saying whether this is right or wrong, but what they've made the call to do is go, taking holiday is probably less impactful on mental health than making people redundant at the moment, or reducing or making pay cuts. And different agencies have just had to make different decisions about that. And I'm not passing judgment on them. It's just important to understand that their intent in asking you to take leave is probably coming from a good place. And that's their way of reducing the pressure on staff costs without having to lose people. And I think that if you're someone who's out of work, you might go, God, I wish my agency had asked me to take holiday instead, because that would have been better. Equally, people who have had to take, it put people who have not made that decision, they've not made the decision to cut costs in other ways, it does put more pressure on the team. And so my advice, you sort of asked, how would I handle it? I'd go, assume their intent is good, because I think it probably is. They're trying to do the best they can to keep everybody in jobs. I think that if you think about the outcome that they're hoping to achieve, you might be able to find a way to make it suit you a little better. So they want you to run your annual leave down. You might decide that for you, that is best done not as a day a week, but as a chunk of 5 days. And mostly agencies will be quite open to that, because the outcome is the same for them. And what they're really doing with that decision is commercial. It's a financial decision, and how you implement that for yourself personally that suits your mental health needs best is probably going to be okay with them. But I would definitely say that they're coming from a good place by and large.
Yeah, great. Michael, I'm going to come to you with the next question. How do we do our job when we suffer from depression, anxiety, and have bad days? So if I get candid about it, we're taking responsibilities off from me to give me breathing space. I think obviously someone may have disclosed that they might be having a problem, but then they feel awful about it because they probably shifted, workload or something onto somebody else. But if I keep it to myself, I'm breaking down alone. How do we manage this?
Yeah. Again, heart goes out to this person. It's really difficult when we're experiencing things like anxiety and depression, and still obviously there's a need to still function and hold down jobs, etc. We can't, sadly, our lives don't stop just because a mental health challenge shows up. The thing that really stood out for me in that question was that idea of feeling bad when given breathing space. So to me, it brought to mind is a concept in Buddhism called the two darts of suffering. And the Buddhists argue that, the very nature of life is that it's often difficult and challenging. It sounds a little bit pessimistic, but I think, if we're honest with ourselves and we look at it, a lot of life, is pretty difficult and challenging at times. No one gets through, life without any sort of significant hurdles, etc. So, but that's the stuff that first start of suffering is just the stuff that life sort of throws at us, and we all get stuff sort of placed at our feet that's difficult and challenging. The second dart of suffering are the darts that we throw at ourselves. So it's all the sort of judgments and commentary, that inner commentary that shows up for us about the first dart. So, we might be suffering. So, for example, we're feeling, we're struggling with anxiety, or we're suffering low mood, whatever the challenge might be, which is really difficult in and of itself. And I'd consider that a first dart. It often just shows up. Don't have much choice in it. But then the second darts, we start to pile on ourselves. So we start to have all sorts of judgments about ourselves as to why am I anxious, or why am I feeling flat, et cetera, et cetera. And in this case, feeling bad about the fact that we're struggling, is a really good example of a second dart. So again, it's really about trying to notice some of that inner critic, and really trying to get in touch more with an inner mentor, or, often referred to as self-compassion. How do we be more compassionate to ourselves in these scenarios and go, what I'm really struggling, this is really difficult for me at the moment. I'm feeling really anxious, or I'm feeling really flat. And being really compassionate in a way that you would, self-compassion is really about extending the same sort of kindness that you would to someone you really care about to yourself, which oddly is really difficult for a lot of people. If someone else, if a friend said to you, look, I'm really anxious, or I'm really down at the moment, I'm really struggling to work, etc., you'd probably be really sympathetic and empathic and kind, and what can I do to help? But when we're in that scenario, we often do the opposite. We just start beating ourselves up about the fact that we're in this situation and what's wrong with me. Why can't I, handle this, et cetera, et cetera. So I think self-compassion is really important. I think the fact that this person's speaking up is brilliant. I think that's really important and should be applauded. As we all know, there's a lot of stigma around mental health, and I think the solution is definitely not keeping quiet about it. I think the main thing that's happening is this person speaking up. I think it's just about accepting that if there's changes happening at work, so people are giving you some breathing space, really being able to take that on board and embrace it and accept it and use that opportunity to sort of self-soothe and, engage in some self-care.
Yeah, great. I'm going to jump into some of the questions that have been asked. We might try and get back to some of the other ones later. So the one that's currently at the top of the list, based on votes, so don't forget to vote, is this one. So, how can we make sure we're looking after our mental health whilst taking unpaid work? After many, many unpaid roles, it can take a toll on personal self-worth and value. Do you want to kick us off, Michael?
Yeah, I'm just having another read of that question. How can we make sure we're looking after our mental health? Yeah, again, it's one of those things that I wish there was a better and easier answer. I assume that the motivation for sort of doing the unpaid work, that there's I imagine there's probably some intrinsic motivation, just going to hide that, some sort of intrinsic motivation behind that in terms of why this person's taking on some unpaid work. I assume that's because something rewarding about it, and the hope that it's going to lead to something else, perhaps a paid role. I think it's trying to find that self-worth and value from that as we talked about earlier, that intrinsic sort of sense of self and self-worth and motivation, as opposed to needing, because often what's lacking in those sorts of roles is that external validation, or this unpaid work, it hasn't sort of translated or hasn't evolved into something more, which might have been the hope, and feeling really deflated about that. Really trying to, again, be a little bit kinder to self and acknowledge, I'm taking some really good steps in that direction, and I'm doing everything I can to get whatever that result is that the person's looking for. It's a little hard without knowing the exact context of it. But I think in terms of looking after our mental health, it's a lot of similarities even with paid work. How do we still make sure that we've got the right balance, that we're still doing all the basics to make sure we're in good mental health in terms of, breaks and structure in the day and exercise and enough sleep and all the sort of general stuff we all need to do, whether it's paid or unpaid.
I think that's the challenge as well, is like often when you're doing stuff for yourself or things like that, then like your expectation on it is so much higher, like what you think it's doing for you. And also if it's pro bono, like trying to get the other party to realize that like you're doing this for free, like you should be really, really grateful. And so when you don't get that back, it can actually be quite underwhelming and quite draining, I think, not to kind of have the two sort of expectations match.
Yeah.
Laura, did you want to add anything there? No, all good. Okay, so next question that's gone into the lead here. This is an interesting one. So a lot of our research actually has been talking about managers being empathetic to the people that work underneath them. But this question says, is there any advice on how direct reports can be more empathetic to their managers? So the conversation around empathy has always been manager to direct report, but not vice versa. I'm a manager and I feel like I'm always trying to accommodate my direct reports and they don't see things from my point of view. Would you like to kick us off with this one, Laura?
Yeah, I mean, like I totally relate to your question. I think it is really difficult because there is, as you rightly say, Andy, a lot of pressure on leaders to be empathetic, and it doesn't always, I think empathy is a two-way thing. That's the reality, and so it can be very difficult when you're in a leadership position when it feels like your perspective isn't being heard or validated. I think that a piece of good advice that I got is to remember that that's very rarely willful on the part of the people that are reporting into you. Like they just don't know what they don't know, and you've been in their position on your way up the ranks, but they've never been in your position. So they just, I didn't know what it was like to be a CEO until I became a CEO, and it suddenly like uncovered heaps of stuff that I wish I'd known when I was, younger, because I might have reacted to things slightly differently. I think that one thing that I've found quite helpful is just to be quite honest. So when I described at the beginning of this, the call that I had with the agency, where I said, you know what, I know it's not your intent, but how it makes me feel is this. People went, oh, right. Shit, okay, cool. I think that you can tell yourself a story that people are being willfully disrespectful to you, or they're being uncaring or unfeeling. Often they just don't know. And a really simple way to overcome that is to say, hey, I just want to give you a window into what this is like for me so that we can talk about how we can work together better. And most people will go, oh, I just had no idea. But I think when you're in a position of responsibility, you can tend to think it's more deliberate than it actually is, and just sometimes a really honest chat where you allow yourself to be vulnerable. Because I think the other thing is that a lot of the time, in one of the big lessons that I've had to really learn is about being willing to show vulnerability. And I think that's, you think that as a leader you have to be bulletproof and you're never allowed to show any, perceived weakness. But I think that vulnerability is a great thing to show to your team and to let them understand what you're struggling with in that moment. It doesn't necessarily in any way undermine your credibility. In fact, often it can really build it.
And I think again, like harking back to the research that we released recently, that idea of talking about vulnerability, disclosing things that you might be struggling with, it is a really tough one to do with anyone at work, but actually we're more and more open to it. Like we've had results back that says, I think it was 24% more people are open to the fact that, if someone's got a mental health challenge at work, then they'd want them to open up about it and to be able to talk about it with them. So it's not perfect by any means yet, but it's definitely getting better.
I think that's a great answer, Laura. And I think, vulnerability, I think, is underrated, and I think we shy away from it a little bit. But as you're saying, I think, when a leader or a manager shows that vulnerability, I think it just shows an authenticity and enables that sort of human to human connection, as opposed to, that, okay, I'm up here as a manager and, that sort of that imbalance and that power dynamic. I think it's really nice to just be able to engage, person to person.
Yeah. All right, next question. What if I struggle with a chronic mental health issue? I have the feeling that I cannot unfold in a high competitive environment. I quit or struggle in silence until I burn out. I'm also curious about the industry leadership perspective about this. So maybe Michael, if you want to kick us off around how to handle it, and then Laura can work on, she's going to respond to the industry leadership part.
Yeah. again, this is a really big question, and it's probably beyond the scope of this session, but, I'll still speak to it as best I can. Obviously, anyone that struggles from a sort of, a chronic mental health challenge, it's a really difficult, it's like anything in life. It's a real, it's really difficult to be sort of carrying that sort of with you as you try and navigate all the sort of other everyday challenges that we all have to navigate. So it's really difficult. I would consider that, going back to that idea of the first and second darts, I would see that very much the first dart of suffering. It's sort of a card that's been, we've been dealt, and it can seem unreasonable. But again, often, in private practice, when I speak to clients, and this isn't to try and diminish the difficulty and the challenges of mental health issues, but I often ask, given this is here, given that this is a thing and it's something that you're navigating, really trying to ask the question of, who do we want to be in the face of this challenge? Because often with a chronic mental health issue, it's not often something that's just going to go away, even if you come and see a psychologist and, they do the best work they can with you. Often people have to live with mental health issues, right through. So often the best we can do is go, right, how do I sort of cultivate as much acceptance as I can around this, even though I don't like it and wish it wasn't here? And from there, how do I then go, right, who do I want to be in response to this situation or this challenge, and how can I best sort of live in line with my values? But again, also bringing in that idea of self-compassion, that at times, even though you might be doing that, it can be really difficult to, you're not always going to win the day. There's going to be times where it feels really difficult and overwhelming, and you feel like, you need to quit, or you need to sort of, leave a role or whatever it might be. But again, we've also talked about this idea of stigma and the idea that, I never like to hear of anyone struggling in silence, because I think that, this stuff needs to be out there. There's no shame in having a chronic mental health issue. The more we can speak about it, the more support there will be, and hopefully an ease, a greater ease in navigating the complexity of having a mental health issue and working in a highly competitive environment, which is no doubt really difficult.
What's your perspective, Laura?
Yeah, I'm going to try and answer that and sort of half answer another question that I've seen, because they're sort of related. I think that I think Michael's absolutely right. Like, we need to destigmatize this stuff, because I think that what I recognize as a leader is that I have the ability to destigmatize it. What I don't have is expertise in solving or assisting people with their mental health issues, and so I'm very aware of where my limitations are in terms of being able to help people. I would no more try and solve someone's chronic mental illness than I would a physical illness. Like, I'm just not qualified to do it. And so what can be helpful for me is to understand how I can best support somebody who has a chronic mental health issue, and to create an environment where they feel that they can come to me and say, this is the issue that I struggle with, and ideally, these are some of the ways in which you can support me in allowing me to do my best work here. And these are the things that I need some help with. And these are the things that I need you to look out for me. That's quite evolved, but that is ultimately where I'd love us to get to as an industry, where these conversations can just be had in the same way that if you had a physical condition, you can say, hey, I've got this physical condition and these are the things that I need support from my workplace in order to be able to do my best work. And I understand that's a journey that the industry needs to go on. But I think it's probably an understanding that the people that you're working for don't necessarily know the answers to some of that stuff intuitively, and they need to educate themselves on it. But it also helps to have a good understanding of how they can support you and have an environment in which those conversations can be had quite openly. And as Michael said, that's about destigmatizing it, because as he says, there's absolutely no shame in living with a chronic mental illness. And if there's ways in which you need to be supported in that, then that's more than legitimate that you should be able to ask for those.
And I think, like, what's true about that is that no one can know it better than you. And so by helping other people, and it's like a lot of, when we got that answer, like around looking for more empathetic, educated leaders, it's also like there is a little bit of responsibility on the individual to say, hey, here's how you can help me, rather than just pass the problem over to your manager or leader. It is, you will know more about it than anybody else. And I think you alluded to the other question, which is like, where does our duty of care start and stop? And I've chatted a lot with, where are we? It's this one, isn't it? Yeah. With Mitch Wallace, who does a lot of work in this area, runs the Heart on My Sleeve movement. And I've asked him this question because I used to get it so many times from people, which is, it's like you just said, Laura, it's not your job to just suddenly become a psychologist and to fix someone. You're not qualified. You couldn't possibly do that. What it is to make sure that you don't make the situation any worse. And actually in Australian employment law, and also in our minimum standards that we created for mentally healthy, it's about trying to create an adapted environment that you can thrive. And I think the other thing we can say is that, when we look at the stats around our industry, more than half of people are showing mild to severe symptoms of some sort of mental health challenge. And so look at how well you're doing, how well we're all doing as an industry, despite what it is that we're facing. And if we can actually understand that, know that people around us are probably feeling something similar or have experience of it. But also that if we can just make that environment a little bit more forgiving, imagine how even better we could possibly be doing as well.
Yeah, and I think it was Laura, you might have touched on this point, this idea of really seeing mental health issues as synonymous with physical health challenges. And I think if we can get to a point eventually where they really are seen as one and the same, in the the same way, if you showed up at work with a broken leg, for example, there'd be a whole lot of support and empathy and people helping you up the stairs, and there'd be all sorts of things would go on to support you in that scenario. But if someone arrives at work at the moment and they're highly anxious or they're highly depressed, they're usually either hiding it, or if they speak up about it, a lot of us don't know what do I do with that? How to for a lot of people, and rightly so, because most managers probably aren't trained mental health professionals. So even when there's that other issue of when someone does speak up, the person, the manager, for example, not knowing, well, what do I do with this information? I don't even know how to. In some ways, they're probably glad that the person's disclosed, but equally they're in a tricky position as to know, and probably not particularly well equipped to know what to do with that. And that's where, I guess, across the board, we need a greater understanding and knowledge of how to support and navigate these sorts of psychological challenges.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, we have, I think, just 2 questions left. So this one's really interesting. So we've sort of, again, it's taking that empathy point from normally this sort of manager to employee, and we've gone the other way, but now there's another dynamic, which is how can we educate clients to be better listeners and therefore empathetic, finding this super hard on video calls where there are delays?
You want me to?
I think it's going to go straight to you, Laura.
That's a good question. Look, I always say, like, with the best will in the world, it's very difficult to change clients because they have their own culture and they have their own, and so I think the question is more about how do you protect your team and insulate it, like how do you create some things within your culture that can allow you to navigate that. I mean, I think there's a difference between bad behavior from clients, which I absolutely think that agencies can and should tackle. Harassment, bullying, discrimination, any of those things are absolutely not acceptable and appropriate. You should never have to work in a workplace where you have to tolerate that from a client. If the client's just not being particularly empathetic or nice to you, there's not always a lot you can actually really do to change them. And so I think it's about finding ways within your team dynamic to sort of mitigate that a little bit. Because in my experience, we always talk about we're going to change clients, but really that's a very big ask of yourselves. And so, I'm not sure that that's a hugely useful answer, but I think it's about how do we as a culture and a team, get ourselves in a space where we can navigate those clients better.
I think you can also do what we've talked about with some of the other advice here, which is like if a client sometimes is behaving irrationally or being overly aggressive or negative, I think you can do the same thing as what we said earlier. Like you can actually just take it out of a work context for a minute and go, hey, how are you doing? You all right? I think it's perfectly okay to like just ask that of another human being. And sometimes I know, a specific example of where this has happened where, a team was getting kind of terrorized by a client. And when their manager asked the client what was going on, it was some like going through a divorce and there was stuff happening at home. And then suddenly it just like, it got it all out there and it was, oh, okay, there's actually a lot of stuff going on there. And even just the fact that then they're a little bit more empathetic to them, it all sort of starts to just make it a little bit leveler. Yeah.
And I agree with all of that. And I think the only other thing is, as we talked about earlier, the idea of, is there a sort of gentle way to generate a little bit more awareness around the fact that this is how it's been perceived? This is the dynamic, perhaps from the agency side of the conversation. The client may not be particularly aware that that they're being received in this way, and is there a way to sort of call out the elephant in the room and have everyone aware that this is how it's feeling at the moment. How do we connect a bit more? Yeah.
Okay, last question. I think it's a quick-ish answer to Laura, which is, how do you navigate doing design work, so logo, wedding invitations, that kind of stuff, with family and friends that only want to pay in mates rates?
Yeah, I mean, I just think that's the power of saying no and knowing what your boundaries are. Like, I think it's when you are a designer, people think you can just knock them up a quick logo or get a quick invite together. And I think it's probably just, if you're doing it and you resent doing it, don't do it.
Yeah.
Just say, I'm really sorry. I'm so busy at the moment. I've got a lot on. I won't be able to give it my best. And, I think your good mates won't expect mates rates, or they won't expect you to do it if you're overwhelmed by it. And anyone who does, then,
ask the question. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Did you want to add something, Michael?
I'm going to leave that one alone.
I'm ready to knock up some logos in your spare time. Cool. Okay. So thank you so much for today. I'm also just going to plug a quick event that Never Not Creative is putting on shortly, which is about bouncing back from setbacks. It's literally a 1-hour workshop on just how to deal with things that you weren't expecting to happen right now. And obviously, it's pretty relevant for what's been going on. So feel free to take a look at that and click on that link I just chucked in the chat. It's been developed by Jackie Barker, who works at Canva. And Canva is an incredibly fast-moving, agile workplace where there can be setbacks almost every day, but you kind of have to roll with it. And so she sort of developed this in response to that. It's really, really great course. So that's coming up soon. Let's recap on a few of the things. I think Zoom calls, let's make it very clear. It's just about etiquette. It's just being polite, isn't it? It's just saying, look, if I need to do it, you should absolutely feel that you can turn your camera off, and that, people are in situations where that would feel better now, but also just bear in mind the speaker talking to a bunch of black screens, which can be pretty tough as well. I really like the idea that you brought up around this, and I think quite a few people actually reacted to this in the chat, Michael, around, it's good to think about planning for the future, but try and time box it and not to ruminate on things that are, that could or could not happen. I think that was really great advice that came across. We've had a lot of discussion around empathy, and actually how empathy is a two-way thing, and you need to put yourself in everybody else's shoes as well. And I think that's really important. Like if you kind of want more empathy from other people around you, it's good to kind of show that in return as well. And really great piece at the end there, I think, which was, in whatever it is that you're facing, who do you want to be in response to what's going on around you? And I think it's quite nice to be able to take that sort of out of body view, because sometimes you can get sort of so caught up in what's going on at the moment and in the heat of the moment. So I think those are just some of the things I picked out. There's so much great advice. It was such a great session, amazing questions from everyone that attended. This will be going up in the next day or two onto the Never Not Creative site, along with all of the other sessions that we've run as well. So you can watch the recordings there. thank you once again, Laura and Michael. It was excellent. Thank you so much for fitting us into your days.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Andy.
Yeah, great. So we'll call it an end there. I know there was great feedback along the way as well. So I think we really covered some good stuff and some pretty curly questions in there as well. So great job. And we'll be back in a month's time, first Thursday of every month, 12:30 p.m. Eastern time. Okay. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
See ya.